Three, two, one. Liftoff.
Welcome today to the Ketamine Startup Podcast, where we talk about starting ketamine infusion clinics. Today, we're going to answer a commonly asked question: can my city's population support a ketamine infusion clinic? And this is a really good question because this will help you determine whether you should pivot or move to another place if you really want to start your ketamine clinic. And in today's episode, we're also going to do a little back of the envelope calculation to help you answer this and more. Stay tuned and let's dive into it.
Yeah, I think this question it's about kind of risk. Is like, how risky is it for me to open up a ketamine clinic? And I want to know. Some people might, really appreciate certainty, and they're like, man, I just really want to know. Like, if I open this up, will I definitely have patients? It's really hard to know because, there's these factors of marketing and the demand. So it can be challenging. However, given that, we do want to share with you one little back of the envelope calculation for starting up a ketamine clinic with you, which might just offer a little bit of clarity in your answer. So let's start with considering what city do you live in, right? And then what is the population of that city? So, and when I say city, if, your city has like, 3 or 4 like smaller cities or neighborhoods near it, let's just all include that into the city's metropolitan area. So for example, let's say in your city's metropolitan area, you have 750,000 people. And this data you can actually find really easily simply by Googling your city name plus the metropolitan area population plus current year. So literally just Google it, find out your city's population. So let's say in this example, you have 750,000 people, and statistics show that about 20% of the US population suffers from a mental health condition. So taking that 750,000 people, let's take 20%. Now that results in 150,000 people that are possible patients. Now, we do know that ketamine therapy is generally not covered by health insurance companies. So it means it can be inaccessible for a lot of people. But let's just put that aside for a moment. And let's just say that only 2.5% of that population is both able to afford IV ketamine and willing to try it. So that will narrow it down to 3,750 patients to target. So that's kind of an area where you're like, these are potential patients from my, hypothetical example of 750,000 people that could be willing to try ketamine and afford ketamine specifically for mood disorders.
Now, I think the thing to highlight here is, of course, you can tweak that last number that can afford ketamine, but also the willing to try part. This is where we're talking about. It's not just an ideal patient, the patient that has no medical contraindications to get ketamine therapy, but you also need that person with no medical contraindications to also want to be treated with ketamine for their diagnosis. And again, we're using that 20% of the population where we're talking about a diagnosis that would be treated by ketamine. Because sure, there's the psychonauts and people that are into the psychedelic space that were like, oh, sweet, you're opening a ketamine clinic. I'd love to which is, that's cool and all that. But we're also, remember, we are a medical practice. And therefore, I would say approach with a very conservative number to determine that population number. So again, it's not only have a diagnosis, but have no contraindications to ketamine therapy, plus are willing, because those are the ones that will return and be best served by you. And so sometimes that number may come out pretty small for that potential patient population. And then also considering that maybe you're okay with it being that small. You already have a private practice, so you're just adding ketamine therapy to your practice. And so you're okay with that smaller number, or maybe you're not because there's already 2 other clinics in the area. And yet, from my marketing perspective and branding perspective, I don't think that's a really big deal, but we can get into that later.
Yeah. And so as a general rule, let's say you do have that 3,750 patients that are possible. So again, that's 2.5% of the 20%. So it's,
yes, you got to remember the number gets smaller and smaller, the percentage.
I'm taking the total population, multiplying by 20%, and then that
20%.
taking that 20% and then taking 2.5% of that population. So yeah, this is like old school algebra math. But, let's say it's 3,700 people roughly. And each patient, at least at our clinic, they'll start with 6 initial treatments. So that's 6 initiation treatments and then boosters Q1 to 3 months as needed for maintenance. So there's kind of like 2 phases, initiation of the 6 and then maintenance, which can be, anywhere from 1 to 3 months, depending upon how they're doing. Now, I do want to add in that some clinics, such as ours, like we're actually using ketamine therapy for chronic pain. And so that 3750 does not include all of the other potential chronic pain patients. But I like to keep the estimates conservative. I think that's just a safer way to go. And that way you're like, okay, you don't have to anticipate it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden 2.5% of the population is now, again, banging at your door. Like I think the marketing plays a really crucial role because a lot of people, they have a bad idea or ketamine has a bad reputation. It's a club drug. There's all this stigma associated with it. So even though that's possible, the marketing side and delivering information, delivering value, giving presentations is really crucial so that people become more aware of ketamine therapy. And now a quick word for our aspiring ketamine clinic founders out there. If you've tuned into our episode today, chances are you're curious about the ins and outs of starting up a ketamine clinic. It's an exciting field, but let's face it, the journey from idea to actually opening day can be quite daunting. That's why we've created something special for you. Think of it as your personal roadmap, a free downloadable checklist that lays out the essential steps you need to consider when starting up your own ketamine clinic. This checklist is designed to help you avoid common pitfalls and launch your trajectory to success. So how can you get your hands on this checklist? Simple. Just visit www.ketaminestartup.com/checklist and grab your free copy today. We've made it easy and accessible because we believe in supporting our community with valuable resources. ketaminestartup.com/checklist. All right, let's get back to our discussion. Stay tuned and don't forget to download your free checklist during or after the podcast.
I mean, it's not just the potential patients that have the stigma or have a negative view about ketamine. It can also be the medical community that you're practicing in. It could be very conservative, or maybe it's not necessarily just the medical community. Maybe it is the mental health community in the area that you want to open up in. And so what's going to take time is, convincing or educate. Rather, I don't want to say convince. I don't like the idea of convince. I like the idea of educate so that they themselves can understand. You don't have to have everybody be on board. You don't need to have everyone convinced, but some people just don't know. They're not aware of the latest research, even though some of the latest research was started in 20 years ago, 23 years ago. And so this isn't anything new, but I mean, medicine, the medical community is extremely slow to change. Adopting new medical practices take a long time. There was that one article on, was it JAMA?
Yeah, so there was an article published in JAMA April 5th, 2023, and the title of the article is, "It takes an average of 17 years for evidence to change practice. The burgeoning field of implementation science seeks to speed things up." So, 17 years for something and that's the average, so some takes longer than that. And I do notice that medicine can be slow to change. I remember in med school, I've said this before, is that they taught us that medicine changes very slowly. And as a matter of fact, it happens one funeral at a time because people get stuck in their mindset and staying up to date. Because there's, so many publications that come out in the field. It's challenging to stay abreast of everything. So yeah, I think the actual taking the hardcore data and science, randomized clinical control trials, turning it into the practice, there is definitely a gap.
No, and with that article, you were saying that it was 17 years. So that fits where I think they were having a growing awareness about ketamine therapy is finally hitting it now to where when we first started out, a lot of people thought we were no better than somebody opening up like an oxygen bar, and we're talking about licensed medical professionals, physicians who have access to the same, scientific articles that are just like, yeah, whatever. You guys are just in it for the money and all that stuff. And now it's changing, right? There's a shift. There's I mean, there's a big shift. I mean, we went to the psychedelic science conference, and that was, oh my gosh, so many people there. And so this awareness of these quote unquote alternative therapies, and I say quote unquote because some of these are ancient therapies, some of these are we are revisiting these therapies. You know, if you want to talk about LSD, that was something that was part of psychotherapy back in the day. And so, you know, there's this growing awareness, and what's currently available and legal and is available for people is ketamine. And so that's why I think there's this growing awareness of it and acceptance. But that you don't know if that's the case where in the city that you're going to open up. So to get that conservative number of what we said, 3,700 people, doing our little calculation here, you're convincing not only potential patients, but also potential referring providers. Because we say take on the approach of working in collaboration, in service with other specialties. And this is especially true for those that are not psychiatrists, you know, like anesthesia or emergency medicine. You know, classically, you know, those specialties are familiar, have been trained with ketamine, and then, you know, feel like, hey, I can open this. But sometimes there's a bit of backlash. Oh, you don't treat depression and all these other mood disorders. So working with, in partnership with other, with psychiatrists and other mental health specialists will be what helps you get those potential patients in. And that can take time.
Yeah. So true. And, you know, kind of to wrap things up and kind of summarize, well, number one, you're not going to know 100%, and there's no guarantee when you're starting something up. So you can do this back of the envelope calculation, taking 20% of your city's population. And then once you get that number, taking 2.5% of that number. And these are just numbers that I'm just pulling out to be conservative. And then that will be the number of possible patients that may come to your clinic specifically for a mood disorder. But know that anytime you start up something, there is a possibility of failure. Like it's a lot of work, and the marketing takes a lot of efforts. So bottom line is that it takes a lot of courage to start something new, a ton of courage. And I love this concept about courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in the face of fear. So as you think about this and the risk, you know, one new perspective to take is, hey, this is kind of exciting. This is kind of like an adventure, right? And so that's one frame of mind that you can take in. One example would be, let's say hypothetically that every time you go to Las Vegas and you play the slot machine, and every single time you win. Like that would be fun for maybe, you know, the first 5, 10, 20 times. But let's say it happened 100 times, 1,000 times. And now you're like, oh my gosh, this is so boring. Every time I go play the slot machine, like I know I'm going to win. Like there's going to come a point in time when it's like, you know what? That's no longer fun anymore. And the reason I bring this up is that when there is uncertainty, there is a bit of fun. When we don't know the outcome, that's actually kind of exciting, which is like why we like movies. We like, you know, knowing like, hey, is everything going to work out for the person on their journey? And so I think if someone embraces this mindset of, yes, there's risk. Yes, this is an adventure. And if that aligns with you and who you are, then definitely consider opening up a ketamine clinic and taking a chance on this idea. Just to wrap things up, we really appreciate you taking your time to listen to the podcast. Do me a favor and subscribe to your podcast player, whichever one you're using, Apple, Spotify, Overcast, etc. And then do me another favor, giving us a 5-star review on your platform of choice. That way we can kind of spread the message, and we do read every single one of our reviews. And so that would be huge if you were able to do that. And with that, stay tuned for the next episode, and sending you all of our best. Take care.